Hello, thank you. And I thank the organizers of the conference for the invite, Miguel Valencia. Thank you very much. For now, for many years. The subject today is a variation of the central subject of degrowth, and that is survival. So I would like to make an analysis of the possible dialogue between two proposals, disappearance of capitalism, that share many things, but they are also the trend of the latest years of acceleration. Both of them can be understood as survival ideas, and both identify capitalism as a threat for the possibility of social feasibility and the existence of the species. So I'll start by defining some of the terms I'll be using for each one of the concepts. Accelerationism is a left current that is based on a parenthesis. It is based on the idea that these forces of capitalism has latent strengths, like automation, and that they have to identify, and that it is a way in which those latencies could be controlled collectively. The first assumption is that for accelerationists, it is possible to separate industrial production and capitalist production, that there is a way of non-capitalistic usage of industrial usage. The second assumption is that possible to have a collective dominion over the production means. So what accelerationism requires is not to deaccelerate the automation of labor, but rather to intensify it, to reach a reduction of labor or even its abolition. Accelerationism, in the left-wing version, doesn't look for any way of adopting the means, but rather accelerating the means of production. So accelerationism proposes an intensification of automation, but it's also accompanied by economic control. This is what distinguishes accelerationism of the technology, and the accelerationism of the left, who wants a political control of the new technologies. A way in which this difference could be explained is that the right wing is only growing at the speed of capitalism, and the left accelerationism is interested in the sense of giving a sense and a direction to technology. So the conversation that can take place with degrowth is only through the vision of the left, obviously. So degrowth, as you know, wants something different from accelerationism. The target is to be happier, working less and consuming less, but also by having a reduction or a redistribution of productivity, a change of productivity. Degrowth proposes a reduction of activity, or rather to cancel full sectors of the industry, like the automobile industry, to promote some other economic activities that are related to sociability, leisure, care, the environment, and all. So this reduction of productivity, as you know, the one that degrowth proposes, requires deep changes, such as relocating production, decentralization, and not only in the sense of how others understand it, which is as a whole in the economy, but rather the reduction in our dependency on industrialization, to have a desindustrialization, not only to produce goods but services. Another radical change would be in degrowth to have a reorganization as a new sense of organization in the balance between life in the field and in the cities. So those changes would require a significant decrease of consumption levels, an important decrease of displacements, speed, and increase of other ways in which to relate to economics, like self-production and recycling. So those are two incentivoid paradigms. On the one hand, it is about intensifying the process that already exists in capitalism, like automation, with the hope or the idea that it is possible to control them in a more egalitarian way, and the other one, degrowth, that proposes to deaccelerate or stop altogether some sectors of production. But I believe that in spite of the differences that are evident, there are some important aspects in common, some commonalities that are important if we want to have a dialogue between the two proposals, because both are against capitalism. The first thing, what they share is the will to overcome capitalism. And there are certain aspects of the diagnosis that match. For instance, the idea that in capitalism, the gains of growth are not distributed in a fair way. They are preserved by the elite. And they acknowledge that the type of capitalism doesn't require labor or doesn't require people so much. Now, secondly, both proposals share the critique of the end of history of the crisis of the future. It means that both of them are opposing neoliberalism and are questioning the austerity policies. Both then seek for the end of capitalism, be it in terms of the legitimacy, its ethics, its feasibility. Both of them also speak of a version of a reinterpretation of the future, a historical possibility, the possibility that things can be different. And thirdly, accelerationism and degrowth suppose a lack of satisfaction with the classical social democratic model. They consider that this model does not contribute to the rethinking of possible different futures possibility. So they reject the melancholic left that only seeks for the welfare state, but rather they seek to go further, the classical melancholic restorative of the welfare state type. Fourthly, in many of the versions, they also both agree in two very specific policies to achieve overcoming capitalism and the construction of post-capitalistic society. Both speak of a way of reducing working hours, and on the other hand, both speak about the establishment of a universal basic income policy. So the abolition of capitalism, the creation of a new scheme of historical times, opening a new definition or imagination of the future, the creation of a new left-wing model that goes beyond the classic social democratic one, and the agreeing of those two policies, the reduction of labor hours and universal income. In spite of that, there are still deep differences between the two of them. For instance, if you consider the demands of the accelerationistic program that has been more popular, the Alex Winder-Resendic, who wrote the book Inventing the Future, we see that 3 of the 4 points of the accelerationistic program are shared by degrowth. For instance, the reduction of the working week, the universal minimum income, and the reduction of the labor ethics to reduce the relevance of wage-paying sources as a means of creating identity and other things. So the radical difference lies on the 4th point, which is the full automation of accelerationism. The radical difference here is deep, because even though both perspectives, accelerationism and degrowth, speak about the existence of a mega machine, to use the Stella Touche term, or a total mobilization, the Alciger concept, degrowth intends to dismantle the mega machine, to redistribute it, to rethink it, and accelerationism is trying to make it go turbo. There are other deep philosophical differences between the paradigm of acceleration and the one of degrowth. For instance, acceleration is based on the idea that human beings are plastic. Humanity is a self-intervention process, of self-engineering process, and therefore accelerationism is related to a sort of post-humanism or transhumanism. And degrowth is based on a completely different perspective, the idea of boundaries, that it is important to respect the boundaries of human beings because there are certain shapes that ought to be honored, and that there's a shape in singular and plural, that there's a certain range of the ways in which to imagine connections between human beings and technology and the relationship between them and the environment. Another important philosophical difference is that they both, accelerationism still depends on history with capital H, the history as in the Hegelian term. So even though both perspectives speak of opening to the future, those futures are very different. Accelerationism seeks to have a future that's enlightened with the modern project's perspective, and the future of degrowth is getting away from traditional ideals of progress. It goes to go beyond enlightenment. So for degrowth, it is not only about to overcome capitalism, but also to overcome industrial societies as a whole. Degrowth doesn't believe, as accelerationism does, that there is a difference between industrial production and capitalistic appropriation, but rather that there is a logic, something of the logic in capitalism that is inherent in the logic of industrial production that would remain, even if the means of production were expropriated. Now, considering the divergencies and the convergencies, we can create a map, coordinates of a possible conversation between both currents that are looking to overcome capitalism. So as of this acknowledgement of the possible limits and approaches or scopes of the dialogue, different, more specific questions could be asked. What can be learned by each one of the perspectives from the other? I believe that accelerationism, in general terms, can learn from degrowth the need of integrated the variable of the environment and realizing that the economic model that accelerationism is trying to intensify doesn't happen in a vacuum, but that has systemic impacts. Environmental impacts are destructive, and degrowth could learn from accelerationism the need to create more ambitious, large-scale transformation projects that go beyond or that combine local initiatives, because that is one of the main criticism it has received, acceleration has received vis-a-vis degrowth. Since they focus so much on the local, they couldn't transcend capitalism. So to be more specific, I believe degrowth could learn from accelerationism about the need of having systemic global answers to systemic global problems, the need to create a collective power and ways of organizing and planning that are at large scale, regional, globally. On the other hand, degrowth could learn from accelerationism about the will not to leave in the hands of capitalism the breakthroughs of technology, especially those related to digital technologies. So these bring questions for degrowth: what to do with the new realities of cognitive labor in digital communication, information arenas, and what to do with the infrastructures and platforms that already exist in modern capitalism, especially the digital platforms. Likewise, accelerationism could learn from degrowth some other important things, especially from the critical perspective of technology and the radical inclusion of the environment. Accelerationism, as the classical economics, seems to ignore the anthropic nature of all economic activity. Accelerationism continues with a classical model of the economy that has adopted the Newtonian mechanics model, but it forgets that time is irreversible. The transformations of matter cannot be reversed. The production of waste as economic activity, they don't go away, and accelerationism forgets that. And degrowth could remind accelerationism that it is important to include the awareness of environmental and resources limits, the boundaries, the limits in of the biosphere and nature and others. So degrowth could help accelerationism remember that technology can create emancipatory ways, but also dependencies of autonomy and heteronomy. For instance, it is important to remember Ivan Illich distinguished between the getting along and not getting along tools. The problem is not the technique, but the way in which the technique can enable autonomy or not. And degrowth could contribute to a certain criticism of the Prometeic tendencies of accelerationism that trend to break the balance of what's created by human beings and what's created by nature. So this trend of accelerationism could be counteracted. This idea of thinking about the engineering of nature, the engineering of plants and animals and human beings would be solved, could solve all problems. So I believe that degrowth especially should remind accelerationism of other left-wing trends and should remind them whether it is really possible to redirect the speed of capitalism. If we follow the Walter Benjamin's metaphor of progress as an accelerated train, we would have to ask then if it's possible to change the trajectory of the train as acceleration proposes when the paths have been set by the railways, because the railways are fixed, they're glued to the floor, they are predetermined. So can we change the direction of the train, or is the only option possible, as Benjamin has suggested, is to pull the brake, deaccelerate, and not only to deaccelerate but also to stop the movement of certain sectors in certain areas as degrowth proposes. So, to conclude, I believe that there are two ways for this conversation that could be followed to rethink the way in which we can find a convergence of the two anti-capitalistic proposals. Both of them have to do with a thinker. The first of the thinkers is Ivan Illich. I believe it's important to mention the idea of Ivan Illich that he called science by the people, from the grassroots, because it is based on the idea, as I mentioned before, that technological breakthroughs are not a problem on its own, but rather that they could be redirected to serve getting along if the limits are honored. For instance, technological scientific progress could be used to create more durable goods, for instance, to overcome the problem of program obsolescence. Ivan Illich proposed the alternative development doesn't have to be a way back to the past or a uniform model, but rather it could be, as Latouche said, a synthesis of traditions and a modernity to give access to modernity to the people who have been denied it. The second thinker is André Gorz, because André Gorz is a significant thinker for both trends. André Gorz is a pioneer of political ecology, as Federico has mentioned, but also André Gorz is another one of the pioneers of labor automation and the possibility of reaching an abolition of waged labor as a business based on the automation of production tasks. So I believe that by following the clues of both thinkers, we could find perhaps the possibility of, maybe it's ambitious, I know, but it would be unavoidable to find a common program to overthrow capitalism so as to take the most important elements of degrowth, like respect of limits and autonomy, and the most important elements of accelerationism, which is to be in charge of technological breakthroughs and redirecting them with equalitarian goals. Thank you.